I had been thinking about getting out of the city for years. The noise, the crowds, the constant rush. It all started to wear me down. So, when I came across a listing for a cabin in the woods, tucked away in a remote part of Maine, I jumped on the opportunity. The price was surprisingly low, and the agent told me it had been sitting on the market for years. I didn't think much of it at the time. To me, it felt like a steal. The cabin was small, just one floor with 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a main living space. It was old, built sometime in the 1960s, and hadn't been updated since. The previous owner had died, and apparently no one in the family wanted it. It needed work, but that was part of the appeal. I had always dreamed of fixing up a place, turning it into something my own. Plus, it had potential as a future rental property. The day I drove out to the cabin, it was late spring. The trees were lush and green, and the gravel road leading to the property was lined with dense forest. I felt a sense of excitement as I pulled up to the driveway. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered from the photos. Weathered wood siding, a sagging porch, and an overgrown yard. I parked my truck and started unloading. I had brought everything I thought I'd need for the weekend. Tools, cleaning supplies, a sleeping bag, and enough food and water to last me a few days. My plan was to clean up the place, take stock of what needed fixing, and maybe start on some small projects. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell. Stale and musty, like the place hadn't been aired out in years. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I walked through each room. It was exactly what I expected, but I wasn't deterred. This was my project, and I was ready to get started. I spent the rest of the day cleaning. I swept the floors, wiped down the counters, and threw out what little furniture had been left behind. By the time the sun started to set, I was exhausted but satisfied with my progress. The place still needed a lot of work, but at least it felt somewhat livable now. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag in the living room, I heard the forest come alive with sound. Crickets chirped, owls hooted, and the occasional rustle of leaves reminded me just how far I was from civilization. It was peaceful at first, but as the hours passed, I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel driveway. I sat up, straining to hear, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it started. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I chalked up my nerves to being in an unfamiliar place. I spent the day working on repairs, fixing loose floorboards, and patching up holes in the walls. It felt good to be productive, but there was a strange tension I couldn't shake. Around midday, I went outside to get some fresh air and noticed something odd. The tools I had left on the porch were no longer where I had placed them. My hammer and screwdriver were on the ground near the steps, and my tape measure was halfway down the driveway. I stood there for a moment trying to make sense of it. Had I dropped them without realizing it? I didn't remember being that careless. The rest of the day passed without incident, but that night, the unease returned. As I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard a faint rustling outside the window. It was subtle, like someone or something was moving through the bushes. I stayed perfectly still, listening, but the sound faded after a few minutes. The following morning, I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. I walked around the property, looking for any signs that someone had been there. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but near the edge of the woods, I found footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. The prints were larger than my boots, and they looked fresh. My stomach tightened as I stared at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Someone had been on the property, and they weren't trying to hide it. I went back inside and locked the door, something I hadn't thought to do before. I spent the rest of the day working indoors, but but my focus was shot. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see someone watching me. That night was the worst yet. Around midnight, I was woken by the sound of something banging against the side of the cabin. It was loud and rhythmic, like someone was hitting the wall with a stick. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and crept to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. Shining the beam outside, I couldn't see anything. The banging stopped as soon as I moved. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I decided to leave. I told myself it was just for a few days, that I needed a break, but deep down, I knew I was running. Something wasn't right about the cabin, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Before I left, I decided to do some research on the property. I went to the local library and asked about the history of the area. An older librarian hesitated before pulling out a few old newspapers and documents. The cabin, it turned out, had a dark past. The previous owner, a man named Frank Carter, had lived there alone for decades. In the 1990s, he disappeared without a trace. No one ever found out what happened to him. The family had left the cabin untouched until they decided to sell it. I couldn't stop thinking about Frank. What had happened to him? And was it connected to what I was experiencing? I returned to the cabin a week later, determined to get answers. But as I approached the property, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. The front door was wide open. I hadn't left it like that. My first instinct was to turn around and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the tire iron from my truck and cautiously stepped inside. The living room was exactly as I had left it, but there was something new on the floor. A single muddy footprint, larger than any I'd seen before. That was the last straw. I turned and walked out, locking the door behind me. I put the cabin up for sale the next day. I still don't know who or what was in the woods that weekend. Part of me doesn't want to know. All I know is that the cabin wasn't the escape I had hoped for. It was a warning, and I listened. I'm Claire, a 34-year-old wildlife tracker and nature researcher. For as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated by the patterns animals leave behind. Tiny clues that reveal their movements, behaviors, and lives. That fascination turned into a career, one that often takes me to remote, untouched places. This time, I planned a week-long solo trip to a cabin deep in the northern Minnesota woods. The cabin was more of a rustic shack, really, just one room with a small wood stove, a cot, and a tiny table for my gear. No running water, no electricity. Perfect for my needs. The idea was to document the habits of local wildlife, especially the deer, foxes, and wolves that moved through the area. I arrived in early October, when the air had that crisp, clean bite that hints at the coming winter. The forest stretched out endlessly around me, a mix of pines and hardwoods. I parked my truck at a small trailhead about a mile away and carried my gear to the cabin. By the time I settled in, the sun was low, painting the trees in gold and orange. The first few days were peaceful. I spent hours tracking animal prints, setting up motion-activated cameras, and jotting down notes in my field journal. The forest was alive with movement. Squirrels darting through the underbrush, deer cautiously stepping through the trees, and the occasional howl of a distant wolf pack. It was the solitude I craved, with nothing but nature to occupy my thoughts. But then things started to feel off. It began on the fourth day. I was following a trail of deer tracks early in the morning when I noticed something strange. The deer prints were interrupted by another set of tracks, larger, heavier, and human. The footprints weren't from hiking boots or sneakers. They looked like old work boots, worn and uneven, and they seemed to follow the deer trail before veering off into the trees. I told myself it was probably a hunter. The area was remote, but not entirely off limits to people. Maybe someone else was out here hunting illegally before the season opened. It was unusual, but not impossible. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that crept up my spine as I stared at those prints. That night, I heard something outside the cabin. It started as faint rustling, like an animal moving through the underbrush. Then, there was a distinct snap, the sound of a twig breaking. I sat up in my cot, every muscle in my body tense. I reached for my flashlight and shone it through the window, but all I saw were the dark shapes of trees and the empty clearing around the cabin. The next morning, I checked the area around the cabin. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the usual scatter of animal tracks near the edge of the woods. But as I circled the cabin, I found something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, the same uneven boot prints I had seen on the deer trail. They led right up to the cabin door before circling around the side and disappearing into the woods. Whoever had been out there last night had come within feet of where I was sleeping. I felt a chill settle over me. I wasn't alone out here, and whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. I spent the day trying to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting back to those prints. I started to notice other strange signs. Branches broken at odd angles, as if someone had deliberately snapped them, and small patches of disturbed earth that looked like they'd been dug up recently. Then I found the traps. They were crude but effective. Sharp metal jaws attached to heavy chains, hidden beneath leaves and dirt. I nearly stepped on one, catching sight of it just in time. It wasn't the kind of trap used for small game or fur animals. It was bigger, meant for something larger. My breath caught as I realized what this meant. Someone was setting these traps near the cabin, and they weren't just for wildlife. By the 6th day, the unease had turned into full-blown fear. I barely slept at night, every noise outside sending my heart racing. I started carrying my hunting knife and bear spray with me, even inside the cabin. That evening, I found fresh tracks leading directly to the cabin again. But this time, they didn't stop at the door. They circled back into the woods. I decided to follow them, desperate to understand what was going on. The tracks led me to a small clearing about half a mile from the cabin. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then I spotted it. A pile of bones, some picked clean, others still bearing scraps of flesh. Nearby was an old fire pit, the ashes cold but recently used. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone was using this area as a hunting ground, not for animals but for something darker. I didn't know if they were stalking humans or setting traps indiscriminately, but I knew I couldn't stay. I rushed back to the cabin, my heart pounding. I packed my gear as quickly as I could, shoving everything into my backpack. The sun was setting, and I didn't want to be out there after dark. As I stepped outside, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own breathing. I started down the trail toward my truck, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. About halfway to the trailhead, I heard it, a soft crunch of leaves behind me. I froze, my hand tightening around the bear spray. Slowly, I turned, but I didn't see anything. I kept moving, my senses on high alert. The crunching came again, closer this time. Whoever was following me wasn't bothering to hide their presence anymore. Panic set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I adjusted my grip on the spray and broke into a jog, the weight of my pack slowing me down. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, every shadow in the trees looking like a threat. Finally, I saw it, the glint of my truck's windshield through the trees. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Just as I stepped into the clearing, I heard a low, guttural laugh from somewhere behind me. I didn't look back. I sprinted to the truck, threw my pack into the passenger seat, and started the engine. The tires spun for a moment in the loose dirt before gripping, and I tore down the gravel road, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I reported everything to the local authorities, but I never found out who or what was out there. The traps, the footprints, the pile of bones, it was all too real. That week in the woods taught me something I'll never forget. Nature isn't always the scariest thing out there. Sometimes it's the people who hide within it. I'm Kevin, a guy who spent years hiking through the dense woods of northern Vermont, always finding some sense of peace by getting lost in nature. The stress from my job had been building for months, and I was craving a break. No emails, no calls, no distractions. Just a few days alone to clear my mind. I decided to take a solo trip to a cabin I'd visited once before, deep in the mountains. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by time, and I figured it would be the perfect spot to reset. The journey to the cabin was familiar, though it felt different this time. The air was colder than usual, and the deeper I hiked, the quieter the forest seemed. I couldn't even hear the usual rustle of small animals or the wind moving through the trees. The silence pressed down on me, as if the woods were holding their breath. It was the kind of eerie stillness that made you feel like you weren't entirely alone, but I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the solitude making my mind wander. When I finally reached the cabin, I noticed right away that something was off. The place looked more run down than I remembered. The wooden walls were darker, the roof sagging slightly under the weight of years of neglect. The path leading up to the door was overgrown with weeds, and the door creaked when I pushed it open, as if it hadn't been touched in ages. Still, it was a roof over my head, and I had planned to spend at least the next few nights there, so I wasn't going to let the state of the cabin deter me. I moved inside, setting down my pack and glancing around. The furniture, which I remembered being sparse but comfortable, was now covered in dust and cobwebs. The small fireplace in the corner had a pile of half-burned logs, and the windows were fogged over with age. I opened them, letting in the crisp mountain air, hoping it would freshen the place up a bit. I set about cleaning up the best I could, sweeping out the dust and organizing things in a way that felt more inviting. The whole time, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't like hearing footsteps or seeing a shadow, just an overwhelming sense that someone or something was out there paying attention to me. Every time I turned my back, I felt eyes on the back of my neck, but when I checked, nothing was there. It made my skin crawl. That night, I tried to settle in. I built a fire in the old fireplace, cracked open a beer, and pulled out my map to plan my hiking route for the next day. But the quiet was suffocating. The night dragged on, and I kept hearing noises outside, branches cracking, the faintest rustle of leaves, but nothing that would explain the feeling of someone being out there, watching. Around midnight, I heard a sound that froze me in my tracks. A low whistle, soft but unmistakable, from somewhere just beyond the trees. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. Whoever or whatever had made that sound knew the woods far too well. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and headed out onto the porch. The beam cut through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows. I scanned the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of life. The whistle had stopped as suddenly as it started. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, but the forest was still, too still. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I decided to get some answers. I packed my gear and set out on one of my usual hiking trails, but something felt off. The trail I remembered didn't look the same. There were patches of disturbed earth where there shouldn't have been, and tree limbs that seemed broken in unnatural ways. I paused, examining the ground, and found tracks footprints, to be exact. But they didn't look like any footprints I'd seen before. They were deeper, as if the person who had made them was heavy or wearing boots far larger than mine. I thought maybe someone else was hiking the same area, but the prints led off the path into the dense underbrush, vanishing into the trees. I couldn't tell if the tracks were fresh or old, and I felt a shiver of unease crawl up my spine. I'd never seen any other hikers out here before, so the idea that someone else was in the area made me feel trapped, as if I had wandered into someone else's territory. I spent the next couple of days trying to keep myself busy. I hiked, explored, and kept to the cabin at night, but every time I stepped outside, the sense of being followed grew stronger. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew someone was out there. The feeling was too overwhelming to ignore. Sometimes I'd hear a faint rustling behind me, just out of sight, but when I turned, there was nothing there. By the third day, I'd had enough. I decided it was time to leave. I packed my things and set out on what should have been a familiar route. But when I tried to retrace my steps, I couldn't. The trail had changed. It was as if the path I'd hiked in on had been deliberately altered. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by strange configurations of trees, rocks, and brush. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I couldn't have gotten lost this easily. But the more I walked, the more I realized I was heading in circles. The tracks I'd followed earlier seemed to have disappeared entirely. I retraced my steps in the opposite direction, but the more I tried to find my way back to the cabin, the more lost I felt. Panic crept in as the forest seemed to close in around me. The woods, which had always been my sanctuary, now felt like a maze designed to trap me. Hours passed, and the sunlight began to fade, casting long shadows across the trees. I knew I needed to find shelter before dark, but the trees all looked the same. My mind was racing, and I started to question everything. The tracks I'd seen, the strange feeling of being watched. Had someone been leading me off the trail on purpose? Or was it all just in my head? Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. A small clearing, and in the center, a pile of rocks stacked in a strange, almost ritualistic pattern. It was nothing I'd ever seen before, and it made no sense in the middle of the woods. But there was something about it that seemed intentional, as if someone had been there recently and they were watching me now. I couldn't stay here. I turned back, heading in the opposite direction. Every step felt like I was being followed, but I couldn't hear anything. Just the beating of my own heart, louder than ever. The cabin was no longer an option. It was too far, and the more I tried to find my way back, the more the woods seemed to conspire against me. By nightfall, I was exhausted and scared out of my mind. I took refuge in a small cave I found, huddling inside with nothing but my flashlight and a dwindling sense of hope. I spent the night there, terrified that whatever had been watching me was getting closer. When morning finally came, I woke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the cave. I knew it was time to face whatever was out there. There was no running anymore. It was late September when Mia and Jack decided to take a weekend away from the chaos of city life. We were both in our late 30s and lived in Geneva, Switzerland. The idea of staying in a remote cabin nestled in the Jura Mountains seemed perfect. Just us, the woods, and silence. Jack found the place on a rental site. The photos showed a charming wooden cabin surrounded by trees, with a small creek nearby. It looked cozy and inviting. We booked it without much thought. The drive there was picturesque. Rolling hills, dense forests, and quaint villages passed by as we followed the winding roads. The air was cool. The leaves had started turning golden, and everything felt calm. The directions took us off the main road onto a narrow gravel path that wound deeper into the woods. I remember glancing at Jack when the road seemed to go on forever, but he assured me we were close. When we finally arrived, the cabin looked even better in person. It was small, with a sloping roof and a wraparound porch. The trees around it were tall and close, giving the place an isolated feel. There was no cell service, which made me a little uneasy, but Jack seemed thrilled. He always loved the idea of unplugging completely. We spent the first day settling in, unpacking groceries, and exploring the area. There was a fire pit outside, and Jack made plans to roast marshmallows that evening. The inside of the cabin was rustic but comfortable. There was a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom with a large window overlooking the woods. Everything felt perfect. The first night was uneventful. We sat by the fire pit, talking about work and life, the stars above us brighter than I had seen in years. The woods were eerily quiet at night, with only the occasional rustle of leaves. When we went to bed, I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the stillness. The second night was when things started to feel off. We had spent the day hiking and returned to the cabin exhausted. After dinner, we played cards by the fire before heading to bed. I was half asleep when I heard it, a soft but deliberate knock at the front door. It was so faint at first that I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, 3 distinct knocks. I nudged Jack awake, my heart racing. He groggily got up, grabbed a flashlight, and went to check. I stayed in bed, listening intently. When he opened the door, the hinges creaked loudly, and cold air rushed into the cabin. He called out into the night, but there was no response. After a moment, he shut the door and shrugged it off. "Probably an animal," he said, climbing back into bed. I tried to agree, but something about it felt wrong. Animals don't knock. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Jack dismissed my concerns, teasing me for being jumpy. But I noticed he kept glancing toward the windows, as if he wasn't entirely convinced either. We decided to take another hike to clear our minds. The trails around the cabin were beautiful, but the dense trees felt suffocating. I kept hearing twigs snapping behind us, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. When we got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The bag of snacks we'd left on the counter was missing. I asked Jack if he'd moved it, but he hadn't. We searched the cabin, thinking we might have misplaced it, but it was gone. Jack joked that maybe a bear had gotten in, but the windows and doors were all locked. There was no sign of forced entry. That night, the knocking came again. This time, it was louder and more insistent. Jack opened the door immediately, flashlight in hand, but again, there was no one there. He walked around the cabin, checking the perimeter, while I stayed inside, my stomach in knots. When he came back, he looked shaken. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was starting to feel uneasy too. Over the next 2 days, the knocking continued every night. Each time, it grew louder and more persistent. Jack started keeping a fire poker by the door, and we double-checked the locks on all the windows and doors before bed. But it wasn't just the knocking. Other strange things began happening. Items in the cabin would be moved when we weren't looking. My coat, which I'd left hanging by the door, was found draped over a chair in the living room. The coffee mug Jack had left on the kitchen counter was suddenly on the floor, shattered. At first, we thought we were just being careless, but it became clear that someone or something was coming into the cabin while we weren't watching. The final straw came when we woke up one morning to find the word "leave" scrawled on the outside of the cabin's front door in what looked like mud. My stomach dropped. Jack tried to stay calm, saying it was probably some local kids playing a prank, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We decided to pack up and leave immediately. When we tried to leave, we discovered the gravel road leading out of the woods had been blocked. A large tree had been felled across the path, and there was no way around it. Jack tried using his phone, but there was still no service. The realization hit us hard. We were trapped. We spent the next few hours trying to come up with a plan. Jack wanted to hike back to the nearest road to get help, but it was miles away, and neither of us felt safe splitting up. We decided to wait until morning, hoping whoever was tormenting us would leave us alone. That night was the worst. The knocking didn't stop this time. It started as soon as the sun went down and continued for hours. It moved from the front door to the windows, then to the back door. We sat in the living room, clutching the fire poker and a kitchen knife, jumping at every sound. I barely slept, my ears straining for any sign of movement. At dawn, we decided we couldn't wait any longer. Jack grabbed the hatchet from the cabin's woodpile, and we started walking. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound our footsteps crunching on the gravel path. I kept looking over my shoulder, certain we were being watched. When we reached the blocked road, Jack started hacking at the tree with the hatchet. It was slow, grueling work. I stood guard, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. After what felt like hours, we managed to create a small gap big enough to drive through. We didn't waste any time. Jack gunned the engine, and we sped down the gravel road, branches scraping against the car. When we finally reached the main road, I felt a wave of relief so overwhelming I started crying. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away. We reported the incident to the rental site and the local authorities, but nothing came of it. The owner of the cabin claimed he had no idea what had happened and hadn't had any similar complaints. Jack and I never found out who or what was behind the harassment. But one thing was clear: whoever it was, they wanted us gone. It's been months now, but I still think about that weekend. The sound of knocking haunts me, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did. One thing is certain: I'll never set foot in a remote cabin again. It was late October 2022 when the four of us, me, Josh, Nate, and Chloe, piled into Josh's beat-up SUV and headed for a cabin in the Adirondacks. The drive up was full of chatter and music, the kind of excitement that came from escaping college stress and midterms. Josh had found the place on some rental site. It wasn't exactly luxurious, but it had charm. A weathered log exterior, a stone fireplace, and a view of the woods that seemed to stretch endlessly. The cabin was about as secluded as you could get. The nearest town was 20 minutes away, and the last mile of the road was unpaved and bumpy. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and barely any electricity, just a generator that powered the essentials. Josh thought it was perfect. He'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks, but I could tell he wasn't thrilled about Nate coming along. The tension wasn't new. Nate had started dating Chloe a few months ago, and everyone knew it wasn't just awkward for Josh. It was infuriating. He dated Chloe for 2 years before they broke up, and while he never said anything outright, the way his jaw tightened whenever Nate touched her said it all. I didn't think this trip was a good idea, but Josh insisted it would be fine. "We're all adults," he'd said. "Maybe, but barely." When we arrived, the sun was setting, casting the woods in a soft orange glow. The cabin creaked as we unloaded our bags and groceries. Inside, it smelled like wood and dust, but it was cozy. There was a small kitchen, a cramped living room with a lumpy couch and 2 bedrooms. Josh and I took one. Nate and Chloe took the other. The first night was uneventful. We made pasta, played cards, and drank cheap beer. By the time we turned in, it felt like the trip might actually go smoothly. By the second day, the cracks started to show. It began with little things. Chloe insisting Nate help with breakfast, which he didn't, or Josh snapping at me when I spilled coffee on the counter. It was as if the cabin was amplifying every annoyance. Then there was the firewood. Josh had told us to gather some for the fireplace before dark, but Nate brushed him off, saying he'd do it later. When later came, Nate was still on the couch, scrolling through his phone. Josh ended up going out alone, grumbling under his breath. I tried to mediate, but Josh was fuming. Dinner wasn't any better. Chloe cooked, but Josh criticized the food, and Chloe snapped back. Nate, of course, took her side, and soon they were shouting at each other. I just sat there, poking at my plate, wishing I were anywhere else. On the third night, the storm hit. Rain pounded the roof and wind howled through the trees. We stayed inside, trying to make the best of it. Nate suggested we play a drinking game, but Josh shut him down. "I'm not in the mood," he muttered, retreating to the couch. Around midnight, Chloe gasped. She'd been looking for her phone but found it on the counter. Its screen lit up with a strange message. "You shouldn't have come here." We all laughed it off at first, assuming it was a prank. But then Nate checked his phone. Same message. So did Josh. Mine was the only phone without it, which made me feel uneasy. Maybe it was just a glitch, I told myself, but the mood in the room shifted. We triple-checked the doors and windows before going to bed. When we woke up, the cabin was a mess. Furniture was overturned. The fridge door was wide open, and food was scattered everywhere. Josh blamed Nate, claiming it was his way of getting back at him. Nate denied it, saying he was asleep all night. Chloe sided with Nate, of course, which only made Josh angrier. I tried to calm everyone down, but it felt like the walls were closing in. That evening, Nate went out to get some air and never came back. At first, we thought he was sulking and would return when he cooled off. But as the hours passed, worry set in. Chloe was frantic, pacing the cabin and yelling his name into the dark woods. Josh was less concerned. "He probably just wanted attention," he muttered, but even he looked uneasy. We decided to search for him. Armed with flashlights, we split up, Chloe and me in one direction, Josh in another. The woods were eerily silent except for the crunch of leaves underfoot. I could feel Chloe's fear radiating off her, but she didn't say much. We didn't find anything, not even footprints, and eventually we gave up and headed back. Josh wasn't there when we returned. Chloe panicked, thinking something had happened to him too. I tried to reassure her, but the truth was, I was scared. Something was wrong and I didn't know what. Hours later, Josh stumbled back into the cabin, disheveled and bleeding from a gash on his arm. He said he'd gotten lost and fell, but something about his story didn't add up. His flashlight was missing, and his clothes were muddy, as if he'd been crawling through the dirt. Chloe demanded to know if he'd seen Nate, but Josh just shook his head, avoiding her eyes. That night, I didn't sleep. The generator sputtered out around midnight, plunging the cabin into darkness. I lay there, listening to the wind and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Every sound made my heart race. In the morning, Chloe's phone was missing, and Nate's bag was gone. Josh swore he hadn't touched them, but Chloe didn't believe him. Neither did I. It was Chloe who found the notebook. It was hidden under one of the couch cushions, filled with pages of scribbled notes. Most of it didn't make sense. Fragments of thoughts, random drawings, but one line stood out. "They don't trust me. I have to do it first." Josh claimed he didn't know where the notebook came from, but Chloe was convinced it was his. She accused him of setting everything up, of trying to scare Nate away or worse. Josh denied it, but his protests felt hollow. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. He'd been so angry, so bitter. Maybe he'd snapped. We decided to leave. Chloe refused to stay another night, and honestly, I didn't want to either. But when we tried to start the car, it wouldn't budge. The tires were slashed. Josh blamed Nate, claiming he must have done it before disappearing, but Chloe wasn't buying it. "It was you," she hissed, her voice trembling. "You wanted him gone." Josh snapped, yelling that she didn't know what she was talking about. The argument escalated until Josh shoved Chloe against the car. That's when I stepped in, pulling him back. "What's wrong with you?" I shouted, but he didn't answer. He just stormed off into the woods, leaving us behind. We waited for hours, but Josh never came back. By the time night fell, we were out of options. Chloe and I barricaded ourselves in the cabin, hoping to make it through the night. In the morning, we walked to town. Took hours, but we made it. When we told the police what had happened, they searched the cabin and the surrounding woods. They found Nate's body a few miles away, hidden under a pile of leaves. He'd been dead for days. Josh was never found. Some say he ran, unable to face what he'd done. Others think he's still out there, hiding in the woods. I don't know what to believe, but I do know this: I'll never set foot in a cabin again. I hadn't spoken to my younger brother, Matt, in almost 5 years. We weren't kids anymore, me in my early 30s, Matt a few years behind, but the weight of old arguments hung heavy. Our fallout had been messy, filled with words that couldn't be taken back. Yet, as time passed, regret seeped in. I missed him. That's why I planned this trip. Just the two of us in a remote cabin, away from the noise and distractions, hoping we could mend the cracks in our bond. The cabin was deep in the Adirondacks, a 3-hour drive from Albany. It was late October, and the leaves had turned, casting the forest in golds and reds. The air was crisp, with a hint of winter creeping in. Perfect weather for a weekend of fishing and hiking. The cabin itself wasn't anything fancy. It was old, with creaking wooden floors and a faint musty smell, but it had the essentials: a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and 2 twin beds. No electricity, no cell service, just us and the wilderness. That was the point. The first day went better than I'd hoped. We unpacked, settled in, and spent the afternoon fishing by a nearby lake. Matt was quieter than I remembered, but he smiled more than I'd seen in years. That night, we cooked the fish over the stove and shared stories from when we were kids. For the first time in a long while, it felt like things were falling back into place. The second day started the same, calm and peaceful. We decided to hike one of the nearby trails. Matt brought a small backpack with some snacks and water, and I carried the map and a flashlight just in case. The forest was stunning, with sunlight filtering through the trees. About an hour into the hike, Matt stopped to tie his boot. I walked a little ahead, then paused to wait for him. When I turned around, he wasn't there. At first, I thought he was messing with me. He had a knack for pranks when we were kids, and I figured he was hiding behind a tree, waiting to jump out and scare me. "All right, Matt, very funny," I called out. No response. I laughed it off and walked back to where I'd last seen him. The spot was empty. I scanned the trees, calling his name, expecting him to pop out with a grin. Still nothing. Minutes turned into an hour. I retraced our steps, shouting his name louder, but the forest seemed to swallow my voice. My annoyance turned to worry. What if he'd gotten turned around or wandered off the trail? I decided to head back to the cabin, thinking he might have gone there. When I arrived, the cabin was empty. His backpack was gone, which meant he hadn't returned. I stood on the porch, staring at the tree lean, my chest tightening. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and the golden light had turned to shadow. By nightfall, panic set in. I grabbed a flashlight and headed back into the woods, calling his name until my throat was raw. The forest at night was a different world, silent except for the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle in the bushes. Every sound made my skin crawl. I found no sign of him, no footprints, nothing. It was as if he'd vanished. When I returned to the cabin, exhausted and shaking, I noticed something odd. The door, which I was certain I'd left closed, was slightly ajar. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the dark. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but then I saw it. Muddy footprints on the wooden floor. They weren't mine. I froze, my mind racing. Someone had been inside while I was gone. I checked every corner of the cabin, my heart pounding, but it was empty. The footprints led from the door to the window and then stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, my ears straining for any sound. The forest outside felt alive, pressing in on the thin walls of the cabin. The next morning, I decided to search the woods again. This time, I brought a hunting knife from the cabin. As I walked, I noticed things I hadn't before. Snapped branches, patches of disturbed leaves, and something that made my stomach drop. A small piece of fabric caught on a bush. It was from Matt's jacket. I called his name again, my voice breaking, but there was no answer. I kept moving, following what I hoped were signs of his trail. Then I found something that stopped me in my tracks. A small campsite hidden deep in the woods. It wasn't much, just a fire pit, some old cans, and a crude shelter made of branches. But what chilled me was the pile of items in the corner. A pair of boots, a jacket, and a torn backpack. None of it belonged to Matt, but it was clear someone had been living here. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We weren't alone out here. I ran back to the cabin, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't just abandon Matt. Back inside, I locked the door and pushed a chair under the handle. I tried to gather my thoughts, but my mind kept circling back to one thing. Whoever was out there knew we were here. That night, as I sat in the dark, I heard it. A soft tapping on the window. My blood ran cold. The curtains were drawn, and I didn't dare move. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, then stopped. The next morning, I made a decision. I packed a bag with food, water, and the knife and set out again. This time, I wasn't just looking for Matt. I was looking for whoever was out there. The forest felt hostile now, every shadow a potential threat. I followed the trail I'd found the day before, past the campsite, deeper into the woods. That's when I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing perfectly still. It wasn't Matt. I ducked behind a tree, my heart hammering. The figure was tall, dressed in ragged clothes, and holding something in their hand. A stick, maybe, or a weapon. They didn't move, just stood there, facing the direction of the cabin. I waited until they were out of sight, then hurried back. When I reached the cabin, the door was wide open. Inside, the place was trashed. Furniture overturned, cupboards emptied, the stove cold and dead. But Matt's backpack was on the floor. I grabbed it and ran, not stopping until I reached the car. I drove straight to the nearest town and called the authorities. They organized a search party, but no trace of Matt was ever found. Weeks later, I got a call from the police. They'd found footprints near the cabin, but no leads. The case was closed as an unexplained disappearance. I've replayed those days in my head countless times, trying to piece together what happened. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back to those woods. It had been a long, exhausting few months. The breakup had hit me hard, harder than I expected. I hadn't realized how much I had depended on someone else until I was left alone with my thoughts. My mind seemed like a blur of emotions, regrets, and questions. That's why, when my friend Sarah offered me her family's cabin for a weekend, I didn't think twice. I needed the break. I needed silence. I needed to feel something other than the ache of loss. The cabin was about 2 hours outside of town, deep in the woods. Sarah had warned me it was secluded, but that's exactly what I wanted.
No distractions, no reminders.
Just the trees, the dirt, and the air. The idea of being surrounded by nature sounded perfect, far removed from everything I'd left behind. When I arrived late on Friday evening, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the shadows from the trees seemed to stretch forever. The cabin was exactly as I remembered from the few visits I'd made as a kid. Wooden, a little run down but cozy. It was small but functional, with just enough space for one person to escape into. It had no cell service, which I found strangely comforting. There would be no calls, no messages, no noise. I unpacked my bag, made some tea, and sat by the fire in the small living room. I didn't feel afraid. There was something reassuring about being alone, about having nothing but the crackling of the fire to keep me company. I let the warmth of the flames pull me into a sense of peace, a brief moment of calm that I desperately needed. That first night was uneventful. I slept soundly, the rhythmic chirping of crickets outside lulling me into a deep sleep. But on the second night, things started to feel different. Started slowly. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise outside, a soft rustling, like someone moving through the leaves. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe an animal out there. I convinced myself to ignore it. The wind had a way of playing tricks in these woods, but the rustling continued. Then, I heard it, a faint tap, like something hitting the side of the cabin. My heartbeat quickened, but I still brushed it off. It had to be an animal, right? Maybe a squirrel or a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. I lay back down, trying to force myself to sleep again, but my mind kept racing. The wind outside grew stronger, howling now, and the trees creaked under its pressure. Yet, the sound of movement didn't stop. It sounded closer this time, like someone was walking around the cabin, deliberately avoiding the spots where the light from the windows shone. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I needed to shake off the unease I felt, so I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside into the cold morning air. The sun was barely up, casting long shadows over the forest. The trees were tall, their branches swaying in the wind, and the ground was soft underfoot, littered with fallen leaves. As I walked around the cabin, something caught my eye. Footprints. They were fresh and they were human. I knelt down, tracing the edges of the prints with my fingers. There was no mistaking it. They were bare footprints, leading up to the back of the cabin and disappearing into the woods. I stood up, my heart starting to race. There was no way I'd missed someone walking around the cabin last night, but it didn't make sense. Sarah had said no one came up here. There weren't even neighbors for miles. And yet, these prints told a different story. That afternoon, I tried to keep my mind busy. I read a little, made some lunch, and went for another walk, hoping the fresh air would calm my nerves. But it didn't, couldn't. As evening rolled in, I decided to call Sarah, just to check in. My phone, as expected, had no service, but I thought I could at least try the cabin's landline. When I picked it up, I was met with the familiar dial tone. I felt a small comfort in hearing it. But then, just as I was about to dial Sarah's number, the phone rang. I froze. It wasn't a wrong number, nor was it anyone from the area. The line went silent after 2 or 3 rings. I listened intently, but there was no sound, nothing but the faint hum of the connection. I slammed the receiver back down, unnerved. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking everything before I went to bed. I left the lights on in the living room, the only source of comfort in the otherwise dark house. But sleep didn't come easily. The cabin felt too quiet, too still. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the walls made me jump. I kept listening for sounds outside, the rustling I'd heard the night before, but nothing came. Just when I thought I could finally relax, there was a knock on the door. Soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. I didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't bring myself to look outside. The knocks continued, growing louder with each passing moment. It was as if someone was trying to get in. Slowly, I crept to the window and peeked outside. There was no one there, but when I turned back to the door, I saw something new. The marks, scratches, long and jagged, had appeared on the wooden surface of the door. It was as if someone had run their nails across it. Deep gouges in the wood, a message I couldn't understand. The next day, I decided to investigate further. I couldn't stay locked in the cabin forever, wondering who or what was out there. I grabbed a flashlight and walked around the perimeter of the cabin, hoping to find something that would make sense of the marks and the footprints. That's when I saw it. Behind a thicket of trees, just beyond the clearing where the cabin stood, was a small makeshift shelter. It wasn't much. A tarp draped over branches, some old blankets scattered around, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. Someone had been living here, not recently, but recently enough to leave traces. Cans of food were scattered around, some half buried in the dirt, others torn open, as if someone had been living off what they could find. I backed away from the shelter, my mind racing. The footprints, the strange noises, the phone call. It all made sense now. Someone had been watching me, staying hidden in the woods, and I had no idea how long they had been there. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. I kept checking the locks, looking out the windows, even though I knew the answer would always be the same. Nothing. There was no one out there, but the fear kept growing, tightening around me like a vice. At around midnight, the phone rang again. This time, I didn't wait for the dial tone to fade. I picked it up, and a voice crackled through the speaker. No words, just static. But then, between the crackles, I thought I heard something. A faint whisper, barely audible, but enough to send chills down my spine. Leave now. The next morning, I didn't hesitate. I packed my things, grabbed the keys, and left the cabin without looking back. The woods, the cabin, the marks on the door, they felt like a bad dream, something I couldn't trust my mind to forget. I didn't care about the unanswered questions. All I wanted was to get away. As I drove down the long, winding road back to the nearest town, I took one last look in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood silent in the woods behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still out there watching, waiting. And no matter how far I went, I couldn't forget the feeling that I wasn't alone. I haven't been back to Sarah's cabin since. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear the faint echo of footsteps in the woods, and I wonder if I'll ever truly be free of what I felt out there. But I don't think I'll ever find the answers. Some things are better left in the dark. It's early November in the mountains of Maine when I get the call. The last thing I want to do is head to a cabin in the middle of nowhere, but it's a job and it pays well. I'm Jack Marshall, 48 years old, a seasoned repairman. I've worked on everything from heating systems in old farmhouses to running electrical in new suburban homes. But this one's different. The job is simple enough. Fix the heating in a cabin deep in the woods, where a family has been living off the grid. What I don't expect is the unease that creeps over me as soon as I step onto the property. The sun's low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground as I pull up to the cabin. The road to get here was nothing more than a barely visible path through thick trees, and I can't shake the feeling that I've been driving forever. My truck's engine sputters to a halt, and I sit there for a second, taking it all in. The cabin is older than most, built from dark logs that seem to absorb the sunlight. The roof has patches where the shingles have peeled away. I know it's probably just age, but the place looks abandoned. Even with the truck parked out front, it doesn't look like anyone lives here. Not really. The small patch of yard is overgrown, weeds creeping into the cracks of the stone path leading to the front door. My boots crunch against the leaves as I walk up, hearing the sound of my breath in the cold air. The door opens and I see the man. He's old, maybe in his 70s, with a weathered face and a glare that immediately tells me he's not thrilled to see me. His clothes are worn and faded, a rough flannel shirt over jeans, and he stands there, eyes narrow, arms crossed. I'm not the first repairman he's seen, I can tell that. But he doesn't seem to care much about the fact that I've been called to help. "You're the repairman?" he grunts, his voice thick with suspicion. "I don't like strangers." I nod, trying to ease the tension. "I'm just here to get your heating working again." Shouldn't take more than a day, maybe two. His eyes flick over me, scanning me like he's trying to figure out if I'm trustworthy. Then he steps aside, grumbling something under his breath. His daughter, younger than him by at least 20 years, stands behind him, her arms folded. She's the one who actually made the call. She seems a little more welcoming, though she's definitely not thrilled to be here either. "We're just trying to get the place comfortable," she says, her voice a little strained, as if she's said this 100 times. "Dad's just protective. He doesn't like people, but he doesn't mean any harm." I shrug it off. People can be quirky. I've been around enough to know that. I step inside, and the first thing that hits me is the smell. It's musty, like the air's been trapped inside for too long. The cabin is dark, with only the faintest light filtering through the heavy curtains. The old man leads me down a narrow hallway to the basement, where the heating system is. I'm not expecting anything fancy, just an old furnace that needs a bit of TLC. But when I see it, my stomach drops. It's worse than I thought. The furnace is ancient. There's rust on the pipes, the vents are clogged with dust and cobwebs, and the whole system looks like it hasn't been touched in decades. I grab my tools, feeling the weight of the job ahead of me. The old man hovers at the top of the stairs, watching me. Every so often, I catch him muttering something under his breath, but he never says anything directly to me. It's almost like he's waiting for something. By the time I've spent hours cleaning the system and replacing a few key parts, I'm exhausted. The daughter's nowhere to be found, and the old man has disappeared too. It's getting dark outside, the sky turning a deep blue as the cold sets in. I finish up the last of my work, feeling a sense of accomplishment. I'm ready to head home, but when I go upstairs, I find the door locked. I knock, but no one answers. I don't like the idea of staying overnight, but it looks like I'm stuck. There's no phone service, no internet, nothing. I'm cut off from the world, and I don't like the feeling. The shadows inside the cabin seem to grow longer as the night drags on. I try the door again. Locked. I walk around the house, but everything is still, unnervingly so. It's too quiet. There's no sign of either of the two people who live here. The old man is nowhere to be found, and his daughter seems to have vanished. The only sound is the occasional creak of the floorboards under my boots. That's when I hear it, a soft tapping, like someone gently knocking on wood. But I know it's not the door. I follow the sound, which seems to come from the walls themselves. I feel a chill run through me, and for the first time that day, I regret accepting this job. I'm not scared of the dark. Not really, but something's off about this place. The tapping stops as suddenly as it started, but it leaves a lingering sense of unease. I try to leave again, this time heading for my truck, but when I get outside, I see that it's been tampered with. The tires have been slashed, the windshield is cracked, and the engine doesn't start. My stomach drops. I can't even get a hold of anyone to help me. It's as if I'm trapped here with no way out. I walk around the cabin again, trying to find another way to leave, but the place is surrounded by thick woods. I could hike out, but with no map, I'm not sure where I'd end up. The cold air bites at my skin as I walk, trying to find anything that might tell me what's going on. And then I hear it again, the tapping, louder now, closer. I turn around, but no one's there. I'm alone, or so I think. Suddenly, the front door creaks open, and I hear the old man's voice. "I told you not to mess with things you don't understand." I freeze. He's standing there in the doorway, a dark figure silhouetted against the faint light from inside. I can barely make out his face, but I know that look. It's the same look he gave me when I first arrived. The look of someone who's been hiding something for a long time. "You don't belong here," he mutters, his voice low and dangerous. "You shouldn't have come." I take a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. There's something wrong with this place. Something about the way he says it, the way he stands there watching me. I'm not sure what I'm dealing with, but I know I need to get out. I rush for the back door, but before I can reach it, I hear a thud, a heavy step behind me. I turn just in time to see the old man's daughter step into the room, her face twisted into something unrecognizable, like she's been changed by the isolation, by whatever has been going on here. She's different now, colder. "We didn't want anyone to find out," she says, her voice colder than the air around us. "But now you know too much." I don't know what that means, but I know that I'm in deep. This isn't just some weird family dynamic. There's something else here, something darker. I back away, searching for a way out, but the door slams shut behind me.
I'm trapped.
There's no escape. Hours pass. I don't know how long I've been sitting in the dark, but I know I can't stay here. The tension is unbearable. I need to get out. The tapping starts again, closer this time, but I don't look. I can't. Finally, I hear a truck outside. It's not mine. It's someone else. A voice calls from the driveway, and the old man's daughter steps outside, speaking with someone I can't see. A few minutes later, the door opens, and I find myself face to face with the sheriff. His expression is grave. "Jack Marshall?" he asks, confirming my identity. "You all right?" I nod, still trying to understand what just happened. "We've been looking for you," the sheriff says. "You were reported missing a couple days ago. Your truck was found a mile down the road, abandoned. The old man and his daughter are gone.
No trace.
It's like they were never there. There's no sign of foul play, no sign of anything strange. Just an old cabin in the woods." As I get into the sheriff's truck, I can't shake the feeling that I've narrowly escaped something. I don't know if it was the isolation or if it was something deeper, but I know this: some places aren't meant to be visited, and some people shouldn't be left alone in the dark.